Rob has been the director of the Changing Character of War Centre here at Pembroke College in Oxford for quite some time. He has a military background and a lot of experience in various parts of the world, but he's also a distinguished academic and author, producing a lot of papers and books on the major question of the changing character of war. And it's been really enjoyable and fulfilling and worthwhile for us to work together. And I think CRIC and CCW have increasingly been working together, and I expect will increasingly be working together. So Rob, thank you very much. You made a tremendous presentation last year, and we're very glad to have you here with us. And I hand over to yourself and Scott through until 3:30.
Excellent. Great. Well, let me say without further ado, if I was to read out Scott's pedigree, it would take the entire session. And I have very numerous, Scott, of your email commentary in the battle for Mosul. And it's on that question of conflict. I want to start with my first question, but with an observation. And that is that many of you may be aware that in the rather catastrophic ending of the Western intervention in Afghanistan, there was a conversation just a matter of days really before that collapse between President Biden and President Ashraf Ghani. And while Ghani was trying to explain the existential nature of the collapse and the loss of the what Scott would call the will to fight, President Biden was urging Ghani to change the perception, change the optics, change how it looked on the world stage to try to persuade people that there was no imminent collapse. Which speaks to the paper we heard this morning, the excellent paper we heard this morning from Kumar about what people think is important. And then we heard also about Abdullah Bahir's excellent conversation this morning about what people will actually fight for, which is certainly not anything foreign. So that's by way of my first, my introduction. But let's go straight to the question, Scott, because I want to really draw out of you your excellent paper you've written recently on this subject, and ask you if you could briefly sort of outline your central argument about why people fight for things which are sacred, and why perhaps the West has underestimated the sheer importance of why people fight for the sacred and not for the material.
Well, I think ever since Clausewitz, but certainly ever since the end of World War II, the dominant paradigm in both military thinking and political thinking and economic thinking has been a fairly strict rational actor paradigm. That is, people understand that others don't always act according to the best relationship between costs and benefits to realize a goal. But if they had all the information, they probably would. And that doesn't appear to be the case for human beings. Now, why has that persisted? Well, I think there are a number of reasons it's persisted. One is because it's based on tangible costs, fungible options, and fairly short time horizons that politicians, unlike John, can get around. I mean, if you look at how budgets are produced and how interactions with Congress occurs, you realize that it's very hard to think in terms of a long time horizon. That is, everything which the sacred is pretty much ignored. And by sacred, I mean anything that's non-fungible goods that are non-negotiable because it's part of who you are, be it secular or religious, like God or country or Holy Land or canon law. And I remember a conversation I had with Leon Panetta when he and Tony Blair were co-chairing a group organized by CSIS on how to deal with this whole difficult issue. And I must say, I found Panetta's reflections much more interesting than Blair's. Panetta said that he went to Congress and said, look, this thing is not going to be solved overnight. We have to figure a way to understand who these guys are and what to do about them. And the question he got back from the chair of the Armed Services Committee and from the rest of the National Security Council was, okay, how long will it take and how much will it cost? And Panetta says, we don't know, but we've got to deal with it, or we're not going to solve this problem. And I think that's one of the most difficult issues. Another sort of anecdote is when Rich and I and Mark Sageman, another founding member of Artists, went to the White House once. We've been talking about this, by the way, for a number of years. And although people nod their heads and agree with it, they don't do anything about it. And one of the comments I remember from Elliot Abrams, who happened to be on the National Security Council and in charge for the Middle East at the time, was, yes, we recognize these values. They're very important to us, but there's no recognition that the other side has these values. That either they're sort of crazy or they're maleficent, but they have no real set of deep values. And that leads to a second thing, which is, I don't like to use hubris, but it comes close. When you believe the other person is basically morally vapid, you think you can just fill them with your own good values. I also remember a conversation with General McChrystal, who said, well, we've opened up these democratic clubs in Kabul, in Jalalabad, in Mazar-e-Sharif, in all these cities in Afghanistan, and we're getting increasing attendance and people are coming along. And my response to them is, imagine you open Pashtunwali clubs. This is the sort of local ideology of folk in Afghanistan. And you open Pashtunwali clubs in New York and Washington and LA and San Francisco and Chicago, and you gave free food around and you showed movies and you had nice sort of local folklore. People would come and you'd get increased participation. But what is the chance that the American public is going to become sort of Pashtunwali? And the answer I gave myself, and I thought at the time, was pretty much nil. One final comment on this issue. And let me make a trigger warning, a caveat here. I work with lots of women's groups in the area, but the notion that you can just impose your own values, however laudable they may seem, on a society such as women's rights, I think is pretty crazy. If you look at the history of Afghanistan, you realize that the prince Amanullah, who won the Third Afghan-Anglo War, and who was a hero to the Afghans, was kicked out after he had visited Ataturk in Istanbul and tried to implement women's rights. The fight against the Soviets, at least by the Haqqani, who had once been our allies, they have been fighting since 1973, 74, since Mohammed Daoud was president, was against the idea that women should have a general education and that secular education should be implemented. And the constant harping on women's rights as a natural right for the Afghan people has never progressed beyond the urban minority. So how do you extend those rights without imposing them? That is a very hard question, but it is not one which has ever been asked by our political leaders. It is just assumed that it is good and right for everyone. As George W. Bush said, it is one of the aspects of a single sustainable model for national success, right and true for every person in every society. Almost word for word what Mr. Ahmadinejad in Iran said about his particular values. And I'll end there.
Well, we're going to pick up on that one, I think, during the Q&A. I'm certainly not going to attempt to tackle that, although I am minded of the observation made by one Afghan friend of mine that he said, I have been a Muslim for 1,000 years. I have been a Pashtun for 2,000 years. The point being that actually things change over time. And if you think in Western terms, it's barely 100 years since women were granted the rights of the franchise in the United Kingdom, barely 100 years. So we have moved a long way in 100 years. And in Afghanistan, things always take longer because they're more patient than we are. Can I come back to this question? You raised this question about costs, and I want to just draw your views on costs a bit more, because you draw attention in your work to the importance of what is sacred that people fight for. And I wonder if you can do something unusual, which is to sort of just apply a value or a scale to cost. Because some things we've been hearing about during the course of the day today have been about the importance of a sense that you're about to win something. And therefore you'll take a risk on even with your own life for something sacred because you think there is a cause that is going to succeed. And there may, of course, be, in your view, a contrasting view about self-sacrifice if you know the outcome is certain death for no actual gain at all, even a cosmic one or some other spiritual one. So I'd like to get your view on that. And with that, what is this willingness to take losses all about? We know from all military formations throughout global history that there are these finite elastic limits, even for highly dedicated forces like the sort of, the Thebans or the Spartans in Greek history and so on. What is the sort of limit that you have identified in your work that could help us understand this nature of cost?
Hard questions.
Sorry.
Before I go to that, let me just make one point more about the 100 years you were talking about. On June 13th, 2001, just a couple of months before 9/11, Arnaud de Bourgegrave, one of the founders of CSIS and the former editor of UPI, had an interview with Mullah Omar in Kandahar about the state of affairs between the United States and the Taliban. And Mullah Omar said that, well, bin Laden, he is a guest. And the reason he's a guest is because he fought with us against the Soviets, and we couldn't deny that for him. But I should tell you, we've placed him under house arrest after the bombing of the Cole, took away his cell phone. He's going to get it back now. He, of course, bin Laden arranged for the assassination of the last serious opponent to the Taliban 2 days before 9/11, which gave him permission. But the Taliban never consented in any kind of way, except perhaps the Haqqani, that's another story, to 9/11. Then he went on to say, and as far as women are concerned, it took you 200 years from the beginning talking about women's suffrage. This is Mullah Omar, right? The blind sheikh who's supposed to be a sort of mentally deficient fanatic. He said to Talmud, it took you 200 years to go through with women's suffrage. He says, give us a break, give us some time. And then he ended it with, and why don't you bother the Saudis and just keep picking on us? Okay, as far as costs are concerned, this is a very complicated thing. The Taliban, for example, it's not just about their ideas and their cause and their willingness to fight. It's a very complicated issue because the government forces and the Taliban forces, especially in the rural countryside, were completely intermingled and mixed. And people on the government side, the soldiers, the routine soldiers, I'm not talking about the special units like Unit 03 and 2, the commandos, who had killed too many Taliban to ever have any kind of relationship with them. There was a constant exchange. It was, okay, we can fight, but it's not okay that I can fight my cousin. And so there was never a real deep division, even between some of the government forces and the Taliban at a local level. It's also to be remembered that the government was extremely corrupt. I must say, Ashraf was my colleague at Columbia. We did our dissertations at the same time. He always had a very technocratic approach to solving problems. It was not a very social, deep anthropological approach. The Taliban, the countryside was starving, okay? They had no real government representation. As far as the government, they were concerned, the government was simply extracting, taking things from them. And so they were able to reintegrate themselves in the countryside, establishing security, establishing norms for daily kinds of interactions. And then the common opposition to foreign intervention was in itself a sacred value that held them together along with their religion. And when things began to go south, especially after Trump announced that the United States was going to withdraw, you had what's typical in war is you had a cascading effect, something that Mark Granovetter calls the mere threshold effect. When things go beyond what you had expected, when things begin to collapse, they sort of collapse very rapidly. And people, especially on the government side, were saying, okay, we know these guys. We may not love them, but this other group, that is the government group, they're going away. So we're going to just join the Taliban. And that happened within about 10 days. Now, the question now is, to what extent will the Taliban continue their sort of self-sacrifice, will continue their efforts at building a nation? Some people think that the threat of outside intervention no longer being there, the very tenuous coalition between Taliban partners will fall away. I don't think so. I think that to the extent, and this may be something that our audiences in the West don't want to hear, to the extent they actually do stick to their guns in terms of religious purity, may be the only hope for keeping that country together. And I am also fairly sure that the Chinese and the Russians were going to do their best to see that the Taliban stay in power, providing them aid, simply because they don't want spillover. The Chinese don't want the Uyghur problem to get worse. The Russians certainly don't want their Central Asian problem to get worse. And making up with the Taliban will help greatly. So I think in terms of costs, the Taliban have shown they're willing to take huge losses. They did always believe in victory, except for a brief time when the United States invaded. They were pretty demoralized. And I think the idea that they would eventually triumph has pretty much always been with them, except, as I said, for that brief period between October, November, December, January 2001. To what degree are they willing to take losses? Well, as you rightly point out, Rob, the general military doctrine that at least I'm familiar with is that when you go to about 30% loss in a military unit, it goes to entropy. I mean, the way the Israelis ran the Six-Day War was precisely that. They would see to what extent military formation among the Egyptians had been destroyed to about 30 to 35%. Then they would just not watch it anymore. They'd go on to the next target, and then to the next target, and to the next target. And that's the way in fact, they fought the war. But remember, there is a difference between state police and armies, like the Egyptian army or the Syrian army, and insurgents and revolutionaries who truly are devoted to their cause. On average, since World War II, they have defeated state police and army with up to 10 times more firepower and manpower. And if you look at the losses of people who are committed to their group and cause, it usually goes above 30%. I'm thinking, for example, of the Waffen-SS, perhaps one of the most effective fighting forces in World War II. They were willing to take 60, 70% losses and even fight to the death when they were completely surrounded by Soviet forces. So a lot depends on their actual commitment to their ideas and to their buddies versus the standard material offers of pay, promotion, punishment, or other material incentives or disincentives.
That's a great. So I'm very glad you reminded us about that. The kind of work that's been done on when governments collapse in insurgencies, they go really fast traditionally, whereas when insurgent movements fail, they tend to fail very slowly. It tends to be characterized by splintering and rivalries and so on. And we haven't yet seen that in Afghanistan. I'm really glad you drew attention to that. But I want to pick up on the thing that you've just left us with there about this elasticity and its sort of breaking points and the contrast between what the Romans would have called mercenarius, those who fight for money, for material products, and those who fight because they actually deeply believe that there's something sacred and existential, this sort of central point of your work. One of the things that Professor Andreas Herr-Dackerotter at Fulda University keeps saying to me is, have we in the Western world lost any sort of sense of the sacred? Have we created such professionalized and bureaucratized armed forces that really we wouldn't ever be considered to be democratic warriors? How do we restore the sacredness of democratic defense, of fighting for women's rights, fighting for minority rights, protecting the majority view, for example, as well as looking after minorities. And one of the questions that often comes up is that you can make a better offer to another side. You can offer them something and say, we're fighting for a democratic process, it's a better offer. I get the impression you feel that sort of failed. There is a paradox here, though, isn't there, when it comes to groups like the Taliban, because what they're saying is that their better offer requires personal sacrifice or even group sacrifice, sometimes in quite large numbers, as you're saying. And that the paradox is that the democratic warriors of Afghan history, they really were democratic because they would get together in a village zhurga or shura. They would discuss democratically what they were going to fight for and how and whose leadership. That's gone. The Taliban have done away with all of that. It's now much more like a hierarchical army. People are ordered to do things, and look in if you don't obey the instructions of your front commander, your Mahez commander. So is this something that's gone wrong at a fundamental level with the better offer that the Taliban were making? Maybe it isn't quite so sacred. Maybe the problem is that there's an inherent contradiction, the seeds of its own contradiction within this, that actually now they're by a hierarchical, very authoritarian style of government is actually going to be them doing. Do you think, I'm perhaps less optimistic than you are, Scott, about this. Tell me more about your feelings about this offer that they've made.
Well, you have two aspects of your comments. One concerning our own side and our own devotion to our values, democratic values. And we find consistently in our studies that people's willingness to sacrifice for democratic values are much, much less than people's willingness to sacrifice than what our so-called enemies are willing to sacrifice for. And that's a very troublesome. I think that the greatest existential threat to our own society is not the Taliban or even the Russians or the Chinese, but it's our faith in our own value system and our willingness to defend them. That's on one side. As far as the Taliban are concerned, we don't know. I mean, the Taliban have been making efforts. It's true. The Taliban don't just come from local groups spontaneously like Athena from the head of Zeus. Many of them were orphans. Many were educated in the Deobandi schools of Pakistan. They formed a very hierarchical group, almost similar to the Shia groups in Iran in terms of hierarchical control. And that runs against the grain of Afghan society, which is much more freewheeling, atomized, local relationships, regional relationships. I don't have a crystal ball and I don't do astrology tables, but I do think that there's going to be an attempt by the Taliban themselves to integrate local groups, not the urban minority. I think they're convinced that those guys are bad, but to keep local groups fairly involved. And again, I also think that foreign help from the outside that will probably ward off starvation, because if starvation starts setting in the next few months, if they can't get goods and humanitarian aid, then yes, then the coalition may unravel for precisely the reasons you mentioned. But if they are able to stabilize the economy and they are able to bring in local groups to some extent, I think they have a good chance of sustaining power, at least in the near term and probably the midterm, sort of like the Iranian regime.
Yeah. Let me ask you a question about I want to get to this brilliant points you make about the brain science behind some of your judgments that you read this question. And what I want to do is just segue into that by hopefully restoring some hope for the audience about democratic warriors. And that is that, at the very, very low level, very micro level, we have good examples of where, citizens face existential threat, they may be destroyed. And that their societies, the democratic societies that they belong to, are under existential threat, and they will fight very hard indeed for the survival of that idea. And also, we've been talking today quite a lot about shared hardship, that people will, at the micro level, fight for their immediate comrades. I've been speaking to a lot of veterans about the conflict in Afghanistan and the fall of Kabul. Rather than, I haven't been talking to the media about it, I just want to talk to the veterans. And what they've all been telling me is they are proud that they fought for each other. They may have laid the foundations of a modern state, which has now been thrown away, but it was each other that they fought for. And I just wonder if you could help us understand the sort of brain science behind that. Is there actually more similarity in the end between democratic warriors and the sort of fighters for sacred causes like the Taliban, or even other groups like Daesh? At that micro level, does brain science help us understand where these things are actually connected rather than different?
Yeah, brain science, for the most part, it's at a very primitive state, and it's mostly to help us understand where behavioral studies are posturing or not, because you can't really control your brain patterns. And if the results are pretty much the same, then when you can't actually measure things like casualties and willingness to sacrifice on the ground, that's a good indication of what's going on. But there is something that it is telling us, and that was rather surprising. So we did, as Rob alluded to, brain studies of radicalizing and radicalized populations, supporters of Al-Qaeda associates, as well as people who had been identified as radical groups by the police in Western Europe and those neighborhoods. And we spent 2 years doing field work with them. And eventually we convinced a number of them to go into the machine and have their brains scanned for sacred values and what they would be willing to fight and die for. And we did different kinds of manipulations. We excluded them in games from social participation with minority. We did what's called peer pressure studies, where we falsely told them your peers agree or your peers don't agree with what you say. What will you do? What will be the effects of that? And what we found was that people, of course, were willing to fight and die for sacred values much more than they were willing to do it for non-sacred values, even if they were religious values. That those parts of the brain associated with sort of deliberative reasoning, cost-benefit reasoning, were inhibited. And those parts of the brain associated with very rapid moral judgments were actually facilitated. So you do it because it's right. We don't care what the reasons are. It just has to be done, which in battle can be very important, because you're not deliberating. You're just going headlong into battle, which what the ISIS would call the ingamasi, those who penetrate, certainly believed in. Unfortunately, we weren't allowed to put any ingamasi under the scanner, because most of them died while they were penetrating. And what we also found was that if you marginalize people even more, political marginalization, for example, sanctions against the Iranian regime, or excluding them from soccer games, then values which had been important, like nuclear program or things like the veil, become sacralized. That is, the more you threaten them with sanctions against things they believe are important but not yet sacred, the more you risk pushing them into sacred things. We also found that the more you, and this we've done all over the world, in Palestine, Iran, Indonesia, Afghanistan, Pakistan, the more you offer people material incentives, money, or social benefits to give up their values, the more they become violent and willing to fight for those values. Mm-hmm. And finally, what we found was, if their peers of their same social group, the group they are fused with, if you want, if they oppose their values, then they will leave the group. Mm-hmm. But if they believe that their peers are either wrongly interpreting their values, mm-hmm, but are really sincere still, or have a different take that is worth listening to, then they will be willing to give up their violence and take another tact, but not willing to give up their values at all. So I guess the short of it is, yes, the brain studies pretty much parallel the behavioral studies and show us that certainly isn't posturing.
Excellent. I've got one more question. I'm going to throw it over to the audience because I want to make sure that everyone's got an opportunity to ask their own questions. It's related to this question, actually, about what the science tells us about activity in the brain and how people are connected to each other. And that point you made there about, you can take values and they can be driven into something sacred by various forms of pressure, particularly if outsiders are involved. And you've written very well indeed about this question so often dismissed, called willpower, which, as you know from classical military writing, is central. The cognitive, the morale, the willpower of fighting forces is always much more important than the material. But for professional bureaucratized armies, they tend to focus on the material and the technological rather than actually paying attention to things we already know. And I was minded when I was reading your work recently that of two examples, both drawn from the Second World War. The Soviet Union was being defeated in 1941, early 1942. They drop a lot of the internationalist agit propaganda, and they start moving towards the idea of Mother Russia, a much more simple, easily identifiable, allegedly more sacred idea than internationalism, which itself was very, very telling. But, of course, they also had military discipline and political discipline in the form of political commissars. NKVD, of course, much feared and very brutal in the way that they treated ordinary Soviet soldiers who didn't show sufficient resolve. So there seemed to be this, on the one hand, willpower in the Soviet armed forces, on the other hand, this disciplinary sort of system. And I thought of another example, which is the Indian Army of the Second World War under British, i.e. external leadership and their willpower. Indian troops were defeated by the Imperial Japanese in 1941, 42, and into early 43. But there are examples of where Indian soldiers, even without British officers, fight with enormous courage at great sacrifice for their cause, for each other, perhaps, but they exhibit this tremendous willpower, even when disciplinary mechanisms are not evident. So the question I wanted to ask you to help us with is, what is this willpower? What is its relative importance? Does it need to be a cause you can believe in? Does it need to be driven by discipline? Or is it actually, as you were saying earlier, more about something sacred and internal that perhaps connects to both of those two other elements? Sorry, complicated question. Apologies.
I mean, it could be a little bit of everything here. I mean, we've concentrated on the sacred and shown its importance, but also group cohesion is certainly another key and independent element. We found that this will that you're talking about, this esprit de corps, is maximized when the two both happen to be operative. There are probably other elements involved. We've just developed measures, what we call spiritual strength versus physical strength. And when spiritual strength, the perceived of inner courage and bravery of your side is heightened, then you're much more likely to survive and to fight. But I've always been intrigued by the descent of man. Darwin, when he wrote The Origins of Species, it was basically all about survival. We now call survival of the genes, but at least survival of the person, of the individual, and the individual's family. But in the descent of man, well, first I should notice that he was puzzled by martyrdom and heroism, because although he didn't know anything about genetic theory, he had already anticipated the argument that, okay, you sacrifice yourself and your family will gain higher status. And therefore, what we would say today, you pass off your genes, would make sense. Darwin didn't talk in those terms, but he said, even if you would lose your family, even if you were sure your whole tribe would become extinct, there are some people who would be willing to fight on. And he called this obedience to patriotism, loyalty, and to notions even held sacred. So he talks about all of these things. And he said, those groups which have a number of these individuals who can then, by their example, inspire others, they will, in the long run, be able to overcome groups much more powerful themselves, and in history's spiraling competition for survival and dominance, they will win out the end. And he says, and this is an example of natural selection. By the way, I should say anthropologists, biologists, psychologists, economists are still trying to figure out what he meant by that. There's whole industries about personal and group selection. No one has quite figured it out. He wrote a letter to the co-founder of the theory of evolution, Alfred Russel Wallace, talking about this. And Russel Wallace wrote back to him and said, "My dear Darwin, it's obvious there are certain matters such as music and mathematics and this, which are just not explicable by the mechanisms we have proposed." Yeah. Darwin wrote back to Wallace saying, "Well, I hope you haven't thrown out, you have not killed our theory," basically thrown out the baby with the bathwater, because Darwin was having none of this sort of religious, transcendental notion. But to this day, no one has quite figured out what really makes heroes and martyrs motivate. Now, work that Harvey's done and his group and work that we've done have sort of tried to triangulate on this, and we've begun to see bits and pieces of it. But the whole story, it still eludes us.